The waiting felt eternal, though perhaps it wasn't quite as long as it seemed. High above the churning waters of the Pacific, the aircraft were running behind schedule. Aboard the mighty battleship Maryland, Admiral Hill's radio operators worked frantically on the flag bridge, discovering to their dismay that the thunderous concussion from their ship's massive main batteries had wreaked havoc on their delicate communication equipment. The Admiral found himself cut off from his airborne forces, unable to comprehend what had gone wrong in the carefully orchestrated plan. The decision had been made to allow the pilots to strike after daybreak, when the pale light would reveal their targets clearly. Yet somehow, this crucial message reached only the carrier group, mysteriously failing to find its way to the task force commander. At 6:05 in the morning, Hill commanded his ships to resume their devastating bombardment, but the thunderous barrage was soon silenced as aircraft materialized from the dawn sky mere minutes later. The relentless pressure of the schedule forced a cruel compromise, ICA. The originally planned 30-minute aerial assault was brutally compressed to a mere 10 minutes. As the warbirds descended upon Betio like vengeful eagles, the island still lay shrouded in enough darkness that the brilliant tracers created a blinding light show for the strafing Hellcat pilots. The dive bomber crews, however, seemed untroubled by the challenging conditions. To the thousands of eyes watching from the ships bobbing offshore and the landing craft riding the choppy waves, the spectacle was both magnificent and terrible. Towering columns of dust rose skyward, intertwined with angry plumes of flame as the aircraft methodically worked their deadly dance across Betio's scarred surface. When the strike groups finally withdrew, the island vanished once again beneath a fire-flickered shroud of destruction. Yet at least one seasoned pilot harbored deep skepticism about their handiwork, remarking with bitter honesty that the great majority of all bombs merely dug a nice well and raised a great cloud of coral dust, which hampered the bombing of other planes. After the carrier aircraft cleared the trajectory paths of the naval guns, the shelling resumed with renewed fury, this time the pre-landing bombardment that would herald the Marines' assault. The gunfire ships raked the island from end to end, pouring shells into predetermined target areas, often firing with the electronic assistance of radar as the thick haze rendered visual targeting nearly impossible. Almost as soon as the ship's batteries began their merciless lashing of the island, the first 3 waves of tracked landing vehicles departed the rendezvous area, beginning their perilous journey toward the lagoon entrance in parallel single files. 42 landing vehicles, tracked ones, comprised the first wave, followed by 8 empty tractors whose grim mission was to rescue men from vehicles that broke down or fell victim to enemy fire. The second wave of 24 landing vehicles, tracked 2s, and the third wave of 21 were similarly shadowed by 5 spare vehicles carrying the same life-saving mission. As additional insurance against disaster, the remaining 25 landing vehicles, tracked ones, available to the division remained aboard the transports, crammed with initial resupplies of food, water, and ammunition for the assault troops, yet ready to replace troop-carrying tractors if the need arose. The scheduled H-hour stood at 8:30 in the morning, the moment when the Marines were to hit the beaches like a green tide of vengeance. But it soon became painfully apparent that this carefully planned timeline could not be met. The culprit was the strong western current that had plagued the transports throughout their approach. While the tractors labored heroically to maintain speed against this natural adversary, the remainder of the pre-landing drama unfolded with deadly precision. Shortly after daybreak painted the sky in pale hues, the minesweeper, Pursuit, followed by her sister ship Requisite, began the dangerous task of clearing the lagoon passage. Smoke pots laid out by landing craft vehicles personnel helped screen the sweeping operation, a precaution that proved invaluable when Japanese shore defense guns began seeking out the 2 vulnerable vessels with murderous intent. Much more helpful was the presence of the destroyers Ringgold and Dashiell, standing off the passage like guardian angels waiting to move into the lagoon. These destroyers opened up with their 5-inch guns, their shells screaming across the water to silence the Japanese fire in thunderous exchanges that shook the very foundations of the coral atoll. The Pursuit, once a clear lane had been carved through the treacherous waters, began the meticulous task of marking the line of departure, boat lanes, and dangerous shoals, aided in this vital mission by the Maryland's observation floatplane circling overhead like a watchful hawk. When the Requisite began leading the destroyers into the lagoon, the Japanese shore batteries erupted again, engaging the ships in a deadly duel of steel and fire. Ringgold was struck twice, fortune smiling upon her crew as both shells proved to be duds, but her return fire struck home with devastating effect. An enormous explosion flared up ashore as a lucky shell found an enemy ammunition dump, and once again the Japanese guns fell silent under the terrible weight of American firepower. By 15 minutes past 7 in the morning, the pursuit had taken up her position on the line of departure. She turned on a searchlight and aimed its beam seaward through the passage, creating a guiding beacon for the landing vehicle tracked waves through the screen of dust-laden smoke that had rolled out from the battered island like a funeral shroud. As the minesweeper plotted the tractor's progress on radar, it became obvious that they were having desperately hard going against the current. The vessel reported to Admiral Hill that the attack waves were running 24 minutes behind their carefully planned schedule. Hill's aerial observer, Lieutenant Commander Robert McPherson, confirmed the delay with growing concern, and the Admiral radioed the task force that H-hour would be delayed until 8:45. When McPherson reported that the leading wave did not cross the line of departure until 23 minutes past 8, Hill was forced to postpone H-hour once again to 9 o'clock, since it would take at least that long for the tractors to reach the beaches through the increasingly treacherous waters. On schedule, according to the original plan, carrier planes appeared over Betio at 25 minutes past 8 to make a last-minute strafing run over the beaches. Once the Maryland's guns ceased their thunderous firing, the radios on the air support net were finally able to reach the strike commander and inform him of the change of plan. The supposed last-minute air attack took place at 55 minutes past 8 as rescheduled, but when it happened, the tractors were still well offshore, grinding their way through the hostile waters. The practical results of this attack were again questioned by the flyers themselves, one of whom declared with professional frustration that longitudinal strafing up and down the beach by fighters is not only ineffective, but a mere waste of ammunition. The naval gunfire bombardment on the landing area was lifted inland when the planes attacked and not resumed at 900 hours, except by the Dashiell and Ringgold, whose gunnery officers could see the landing waves approaching through their powerful optics. For about 10 minutes, the lead amphibious tractors could rely only on the two destroyers for covering fire, and on the pair of 50-caliber machine guns that each landing vehicle tracked one had mounted on its bow like twin fangs ready to strike. These guns opened up with their distinctive chatter when the line of tractors passed the end of the long pier and ground their way over the reef's razor-sharp edge, heading into the maw of death that awaited them on the beaches. The attack troops were headed for 3 beaches that would live forever in Marine Corps legend, Red 1, which ran about 700 yards from the northwest tip of the island to a point about midway to the coastal pier, an area that included the beak and throat of what the planners called the Betio bird. Red 2, the shortest beach at 600 yards long, which covered the rest of the distance to the pier, and Red 3, which stretched 800 yards from the east side of the pier to a point opposite the end of the airfield. The pier dominated the landing area like a concrete finger pointing accusingly at the approaching Marines, and its neutralization as an enemy strongpoint was absolutely essential to the success of the operation. The knockout job was given to First Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins and his 2nd Scout Sniper Platoon, a unit of expert marksmen who had been hand-picked for this dangerous mission. Hawkins' men were all expert riflemen, and their 30-year-old leader, a Texan who had been field commissioned on Guadalcanal, was precisely the man to head such a special outfit. He earned the distinction of being the first Marine to land at Betio, an honor that would cost him dearly. His landing craft vehicle personnel, carrying half his outfit, touched down at the edge of the reef at 55 minutes past 8 as the planes were beginning their strafing runs overhead. Hawkins, accompanied by an engineer officer, 2nd Lieutenant Alan Leslie, and 4 of the scouts, ran up the ramp leading from the reef to the top of the pier and moved among a pile of fuel drums that was stacked there like a metallic maze. At first, the platoon commander signaled confidently for the rest of his men to follow him up onto the pier, but when Japanese small arms fire began smacking into the drums with deadly precision, he waved the rest of the Marines back to safety. The 6 men then moved rapidly down the pier, wiping out the few Japanese defenders and destroying any structure that might house enemy guns with the methodical efficiency of seasoned warriors. 2 shacks, which were set ablaze by the flamethrower Leslie carried, burned rapidly, and the fire spread to the pier itself, eating its way through the planking like a hungry beast. The resulting gap in the pier would hinder resupply operations later, but at this point in the proceedings, it was of little consequence. Hawkins and his small group had done their job well. No enemy would use the pier to pour flanking fire into the landing waves that were approaching like a green tide. With his mission accomplished, Lieutenant Hawkins left the pier, got back in his landing craft vehicle personnel, and tried to use a boat channel that ran along the west side of the pier to reach Betio. The water proved to be too shallow to float the boat over the reef, even in the channel, and Hawkins' platoon eventually reached the island after transferring to landing vehicles tracked. In that transfer, they were fortunate, at least for the immediate moment, since the amphibious tractor's light armor gave them some protection from the storm of enemy fire that was sweeping the waters off Betio like a steel hurricane. Those Marines who could not find a landing vehicle tracked to ride to shore faced a never-to-be-forgotten experience. Those that lived through it would carry the memories forever. The Japanese defenders were more than ready to take on the Marines with every weapon at their disposal. The intelligence reports had been grimly accurate, and the preliminary bombardment had proven largely ineffective. Vast numbers of enemy troops with countless guns still manned the coastal defenses like demons guarding the gates of hell. Shells burst over the tractors as they reached an area about 3,000 yards from shore, and this deadly fire continued as the evenly spaced lines moved inexorably forward. As the landing vehicles tracked cleared the reef edge and lumbered onto the coral surface, enemy machine gun fire slashed across the water like invisible scythes, and anti-boat guns began zeroing in on individual tractors with deadly precision. The most fortunate attack battalion proved to be the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. They received the major benefit from the destroyer fire coming from the lagoon, which hammered Red 3 without let-up until 10 minutes past 9. The first landing vehicles tracked crawled out of the water 7 minutes later, and were soon followed by the faster landing vehicles tracked 2s of the 2nd and 3rd waves. 2 of the lead tractors found a break in the seawall and continued inland until they reached the airfield taxi strip, where men of Company E rolled over the sides and took up defensive positions with the practiced efficiency of veterans. The rest of Company E, Company F, and a platoon from Company G, 2-sex Trex, the tractor attack element of 522 men, suffered less than 25 casualties in the landing, a miracle considering the circumstances. As the landing vehicles tracked moved back to sea, many backed off the beach to keep their armored cabs facing the shore, for the Japanese were gradually recovering from the preliminary bombardment, and the volume and tempo of defensive fire was picking up ominously on the eastern beach. Inland, the Marines of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines were attacking pillboxes and gun positions with grim determination, and the brief holiday on Red 3 was rapidly coming to an end. Red 3 was the only place on Betio where the attack waves got ashore with relative ease. In the center, off Red 2, the enemy fire was absolutely lethal. Several tractors carrying men of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, were struck by artillery and anti-boat guns. Dead and wounded drivers slumped over their controls, while the survivors of direct hits had to jump down into the shallow water and wade in, braving the machine gun fire that swept the reef like a deadly rain. For those who reached Betio in the landing vehicles tracked, the beach proved no safer than the reef had been. The first wave of amphibious tractors ground ashore at 22 minutes past 9, and when the Marines poured over the sides, they were immediately chewed up by small arms fire coming from the front, and both flanks in a deadly crossfire that showed no mercy. 2 platoons of Company E landed on the right half of Red 2 and were able to move only a short distance inland against the harrowing fire. Casualties among officers and non-commissioned officers mounted alarmingly as the enemy seemed to target leaders with particular malice. The remaining platoon of Company E landed on the extreme left of Red 1, got over the seawall, and knocked out a Japanese strongpoint despite its murderous fire. Then the platoon leader went down, and what was left of the platoon took cover in a large shell hole, surrounded by death and destruction. In the left center of Red 2, Company F lost about half its strength in getting to the beach and over the seawall. The survivors set up a series of positions held by small groups of riflemen and machine gunners about 50 yards inland. There was no contact that morning with Company E on the right. Radios failed to work in the salt spray and sand, and runners became fair game for enemy snipers who seemed to lurk behind every piece of debris. Most of the 3rd Attack Company, Company G, landed between the areas held by the other 2, taking severe losses to reach the beach and the doubtful shelter of the log barricade. Already the narrow strip of sand was crowded with casualties, with men using the wall as a firing parapet. and with the remnants of headquarters groups trying to establish some form of control in the chaotic conditions of the first hour of fighting ashore. Acts of courage were commonplace in the confused fighting on the beaches, but some men stood out like beacons of heroism in the darkness of war. Staff Sergeant William James Bordelon of Texas, an attack engineer from the 1st Battalion, 18th Marines, saw his amphibious tractor knocked out on the run to the beach. Only 4 men survived the enemy shell that claimed their vehicle. Bordelon led this remnant ashore and immediately prepared 2 demolition charges, blowing up 2 enemy pillboxes that were firing on the tractors with devastating effect. Attacking a 3rd position, he was hit by machine gun fire, but kept going with the determination of a man possessed, using a rifle to provide covering fire for other Marines scaling the seawall. Waving away corpsmen who wanted to treat his wounds, he next raced out into the water to pick up an injured Marine who was calling for help, then assisted another wounded man to reach shore as he returned to the beach. Not stopping for even a moment's rest, he prepared another demolition charge and single-handedly attacked a Japanese emplacement. This time the enemy gunners cut the incredible sergeant down, but his courage had inspired every man who witnessed it. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first of 4 Marines of the 2nd Division to win their nation's highest decoration at Tarawa. A complex of Japanese emplacements bristling with anti-boat and machine guns located near the Red 1 Red 2 boundary proved to be one of the principal causes of a disorganized landing on Red 1 by the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. Company K, the left attack unit, was particularly hard hit. A number of its tractors were knocked out, and the men were cut to pieces as they waded to shore through water that turned red with their blood. On the right, Company 1, landing at about 10 minutes past 9, was not hit as hard in the water, but many of its men, including the company commander, were dead as the attack pressed inland. Fire was coming from the strong points on the left flank, from enemy positions to the front, and from Green Beach, the western end of the island. Losses mounted alarmingly, but some unexpected reinforcements came ashore behind the attack waves. The devastating fire from the Japanese position on the beach boundary drove the landing vehicles tracked, carrying a platoon of Company G of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, to land on the right of Red 1, where they joined the furious battle with the desperation of men who knew their survival depended on victory. In each of the landing formations, the battalion commander and part of his headquarters group travelled in a free boat between the 3rd and 4th waves, ready to land as circumstances warranted. Each of these men reached Betio in a different way, illustrative of the grim morning's proceedings. One came ashore unscathed, another was brought in by a burial detail, and the 3rd landed on the wrong beach and did not reach his unit on D-Day. Off Red 3, Major Henry Jim Crow, an ex-enlisted man with a bushy red moustache and a bull bellow that could be heard above the sound of battle, saw that his landing craft mechanized could not make it to the beach and did not wait for a landing vehicle tracked to come back and pick him up. Ordering his coxswain to lower the boat's ramp and his own men to spread out, the major led his headquarters group to the beach with characteristic nerve, reaching Red 3 only 4 minutes behind the 3rd attack wave of landing vehicles tracked 2s. Enemy fire was not yet heavy on Red 3, thanks to the destroyer's continuing bombardment, but Crow's group was the last that would wade or ride in without being cut to pieces by Japanese fire. The window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Randolph Amy, a tall, handsome officer who commanded the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, was destined never to see victory. He had hailed 2 landing vehicles tracked returning from the beach and transferred his headquarters element to them. Then, when his tractor was about 200 yards from land, it was stopped by a tangle of barbed wire, and everyone, about 15 officers and men, dismounted for the dangerous walk through the increasingly shallow water. A fusillade of machine gun fire cut Amy down along with 3 others. The remainder slogged ahead to the shelter of a wrecked boat, where Lieutenant Colonel Walter Irving Jordan, an observer from the 4th Marine Division and the senior officer present, announced that he was taking command until the battalion executive officer, Major Howard J. Rice, could get ashore. Forging ahead again despite the deadly fire that seemed to come from every direction, Jordan's group reached the beach at about 10 o'clock and set up shop in a shell hole amid the awesome scene of carnage and destruction. The headquarters radios were all out of action, damaged by enemy fire or by immersion in seawater. When runners from the 3 rifle companies found the command group, the messages all carried grim news. They added up to reports of crippling casualties, little forward progress, and no connected front. The situation on Red One was slightly brighter than on the center beach, but none of the senior commanders knew it. Again, the salt water had played havoc with the battalion radios, and contact with the rest of the division was sporadic at best. This did not deter the officer who ended up commanding the troops on the northwest tip of Betio. Major Michael Patrick Ryan led Company L, which made up most of the fourth wave. As his boat approached the reef, he saw that it was littered with holed and smoking tractors, most of them to the left of the landing area where Company K had gone in. Some men were standing up and moving inland on the right section of the beach near the beak of the island. Ryan therefore directed the landing craft to bear to the right, to the west of the hulk of a wrecked Japanese ship that lay on the reef like a metal tombstone, and to head for the beach. The landing craft vehicle's personnel grounded on the coral about 500 yards from shore, and the men began the long walk as Japanese shells exploded in their midst and machine gun fire raked the ragged lines. The major commandeered a landing vehicle tracked coming back from the beach, climbed aboard, and headed it back to land. When he jumped down on Betio and looked back, all he could see was heads with rifles held over them. Many of his men, wanting to make themselves as small a target as possible, were crouched low in the water, but they were still coming on with the determination that would make them legends. About 100 to 150 yards out, the reef shelved upward and the water offered little concealment. Here the men picked up the pace a bit, but there was no respite from enemy fire, and Marines were dropping on every hand like leaves in an autumn storm. By the time Company L and its attached 81mm mortar platoon reached shore, the fourth wave had suffered 35% casualties. The battalion commander of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, Major John Frederick Schotel, was busy while Ryan and his men were moving ashore through the deadly gauntlet. He spotted some landing craft mechanized, which were carrying medium tanks intended for Red One, starting to turn away from the reef edge, and he ordered them to reverse course and land the tanks. Then, as the mediums were carefully following guides to the beach, Schotel assessed the situation for the remainder of his battalion still waiting in boats offshore. Few landing vehicles tracked were coming back from Red One. The long stretch of water off the beach was dotted with wrecked vehicles, and dead Marines floated aimlessly everywhere like grim reminders of the cost of war. The Japanese fire was obviously exacting a murderous toll from Ryan's men during their passage. Under these circumstances, Major Schotel made the difficult decision to hold up landing the rest of the 3rd Battalion. At 9:59, Schotel radioed Shoup. Troops held up on reef on right flank of Red One, troops receiving heavy fire in water. Shoup replied with characteristic directness, "Land Red 2 and work west." The answer came back with discouraging honesty. "We have nothing left to land." For several hours, Schotel and his remaining men stayed off the reef, while the only troops to reach Red One alive were those in tractors who were driven west from the Red 2 landing lanes by the fire of the strongpoints at the juncture of Red 1 and 2. Finally, at 14:58, when Major Schotel reported that he was out of contact with his attack units and had still not landed the rest of his battalion, the division commander took a direct hand in the message traffic, directing the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines commander to land at any cost, regain control of your battalion, and continue the attack. Schotel and his men, following Colonel Shoup's earlier orders, got ashore on Red 2 late that evening. This exchange had little effect on the course of operations ashore, but it did heighten the anxiety about the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines' fate. The lack of radio contact with the western beachhead, Cheps, for there were now 2 distinct beachheads on Betio, was not uncommon elsewhere on the island. The Marine radios were low-power sets, the TBX and TBY. The first had little range, and the other frequently failed when it got wet. So there were many times ashore when the only means of communication were runners or wire, and both the messengers and the wiremen were fair game for enemy snipers and machine gunners who seemed to be everywhere. Offshore, the commanders were often mystified about what was happening on Betio. The reports of aerial observers were useful, but they could not tell General Smith or Admiral Hill who was doing the things that they saw. As a consequence, a steady stream of officer messengers and observers were sent ashore to find out what was going on, often at great risk to their lives. Enough of the radio messages concerning the situation ashore got through, however, for Colonel David Munro Shoup to take charge of the attack operations as he tried his own luck at landing on Betio. The 2nd Combat Team Headquarters Group, embarked in a landing craft vehicle personnel, reached the reef near the pier as turnaround amphibious tractors were coming out from the beaches like wounded animals seeking refuge. Hailing a landing vehicle tract that was carrying casualties from Red 2 to the transports, Shoup had the wounded Marines transferred to his boat. He then boarded the tractor, taking with him a small staff that included his operations officer and the regimental surgeon, an observer, Lieutenant Colonel Evans Fordyce Carlson, and the commanding officer of the team's artillery battalion, the 1st Battalion, 10th Marines, Lieutenant Colonel Presley Rixey. After an abortive attempt to land on Red 3 that was turned back by heavy enemy fire, Shoup's landing vehicle tract headed for the center beach. The Japanese were just as unwilling to have the tractor land on Red 2. A hail of shell fragments ripped at the amphibious tractor's occupants, and then halfway to the beach, Shoup recalled, "A kid named White was shot, the landing vehicle tract was holed, and the driver went into the water." With the amphibious tractor stalled, the colonel said, "Let us get out of here," and suiting actions to words, led the command group over the side. The party waded to the shelter of the pier, which was a frame structure with occasional sections of coral rock fill that offered some cover from the deadly Japanese guns. It was while he was proceeding toward Betio that Shoup, at 58 minutes past 9, ordered his reserve battalion, the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, to land on Red 2. When this unit, commanded by Major Woodbyers Kyle, reached the reef about 10:30, a naval boat flotilla commander told him that no landing craft could reach the island and that his men would have to transfer to tractors. Enough landing vehicles tracked had survived the initial landing and return across the fire-swept water to load Companies A and B. Company C eventually found enough tractors about noon to make its run-in, but there were no landing vehicles tracked available for the rest of the battalion. Headquarters Company was left in its boats under the battalion executive officer to come ashore as soon as it could. Even though Kyle was fortunate enough to gather enough amphibious tractors to land his rifle companies, they were not spared the effects of the continuous enemy fusillade. Some landing vehicles tracked were hit, and the units in them were decimated as they waded to the beach. Again, the defensive complex at the right flank of Red 2 produced fire so heavy and accurate that it broke up the landing formations and forced tractors carrying a good part of the 1st Battalion, 4 officers and 110 men, to shift west to land in Major Ryan's beachhead. Since the Japanese position was already responsible for sending him 1 rifle and 2 machine gun platoons from the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, by the same route, and for the same reason, the commander on Red 1 could, by twisted logic, be thankful to the enemy gunners. His own battalion had suffered so many casualties, almost 50% among attack units during the morning's fighting, that any and all reinforcements were welcome. The matter of reinforcements concerned the division commander as well. Soon after, Colonel Shoup committed Major Kyle's battalion, General Julian Constance Smith ordered Colonel Elmer Elliott Hall, commanding the 8th Marines, to send his 3rd Battalion to the line of departure to report to Shoup. At 3 minutes past 11, when the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines commander, Major Robert Hughes Rood, contacted the colonel, he was ordered to land his unit in support of Major Crow's battalion. There were no tractors available when Rood's first waves reached the reef, and the Marines of Companies K and L stepped off the ramps of their boats to brave the barrier of enemy fire. Even as the Japanese began to find their marks, some of the men, heavily laden with combat gear, stepped into deep holes in the reef and were dragged under, drowned before they were shot. For the rest of the men in the 2 companies, the long 700-yard walk through shoulder-high, then chest-high, waist-high, and knee-high water was horrible and never forgotten. Shoup and his staff from their position at the pier could see the terrible carnage and waved to the nearest men of the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, to come over to the pier and its partial cover. Some Marines saw the frantically waving officers and reached the pier, thoroughly shaken by their experience. The rest trudged onward toward the beach, pushing their way through water tinged with blood and whipped by shell explosions and crisscrossing lines of machine gun fire. Cadavers lay everywhere. The wounded who could walk alone staggered on. Those who were hurt too badly were helped by the men nearest to them, men who were often hit themselves before they reached the shore. Only about 100 men, 30% of the first wave, got to Betio in one piece. The Marines in the 2nd and 3rd waves of Rood's outfit could see what was happening as they too started for shore. Their commanders decided to move in along the pier, and the boats unloaded there. As the men walked along the trestles, some of them moved under the pier to the Red 2 side, but the enemy fire was just as strong there. Major Rood, who had lost radio contact with Colonel Shoup, reported to Colonel Hall that his third wave was practically wiped out in its landing and that his fourth wave had pulled away from the pier's end after unloading a few men. The Japanese, attracted by the tempting target of the milling boats, had concentrated their fire on the pier, and the fourth wave was considerably disorganized. As Rood withdrew the boats out of range of small arms fire to regroup, he received a message from the Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General Leo Dewey Hermley, who was on board the transport Monrovia with Colonel Hall, to land no further troops until directed. Colonel Shoup, at this point shortly before noon, had reached Betio and selected a command post site near the center of the marine-held portion of Red-2. His headquarters was located on the beach side of a big sand-covered Japanese bunker that afforded some shelter from enemy fire. The combat team commander was now better able to take stock of what was happening on Betio, and the picture he assembled was not an encouraging one. Major Crow's 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, seemed to be in the best shape. It held the most territory, with forward positions near the airfield and his men in some places nearly 200 yards inland. Lieutenant Colonel Jordan, whom Shoup had ordered to retain command of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, could report that his Marines had a tenuous hold on a beachhead of scattered positions no more than 75 yards deep, a fact that the regimental commander could easily verify, since his command post was repeatedly the target of sniper fire. As for the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, Shoup knew from reports that he had received from Choetel and from messages that got through from the Maryland that Marines were ashore on the western part of the island. That was about all he knew of his 3rd Battalion's situation. The 2 reinforcing battalions that were landing in increments throughout the midday period were sorely needed. Kyle's men were fed into the front lines near the pier to the left of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, as soon as they reached shore. As the Marines of the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines came trickling in, they immediately came under the command of Major Crow, who used them to bolster his own lines. In many instances, the late arrivals were in worse shape than the original attack troops, having suffered heavier casualties and being more disrupted by the scattering of units in the landings. Despite the touch-and-go nature of the fighting and his severe personnel losses, there was a tough confidence exuded by Shoup that pervaded his command post like an aura of determination. At 12:30, not trusting the erratic radios that had already failed him often, the colonel resolved to send an officer back to the command ship to give the division and attack force commanders a first-hand account of the marine situation on Betio and to explain the plan he had formulated to capture the island, to attack south and west, to unite the 2 beachheads before attempting to seize the eastern end. Not knowing how the battle was faring on Red-1, he wanted any available reserves landed on Red-2 where he could use them to best advantage. He chose Lieutenant Colonel Carlson to explain the situation to those on the Maryland, and added with characteristic determination, "You tell the General and the Admiral that we are going to stick and fight it out." While Carlson was making his way out to the command ship, General Smith was digesting the fragmentary reports he had received from shore and the word he got from aerial observers. Since the battleship was the communication hub of the operation, he was in a good position to assess what could be done to help Shoup. With the commitment of the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, the General had only 1 infantry battalion in reserve, and it too was standing by to land. Colonel Hall had received orders to boat the remainder of his combat team soon after the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines reported to Shoup. Regimental headquarters and the 1st Battalion were ordered to move to the line of departure at 13:43. 12 minutes earlier, after he had reported the situation at Betio to General Holland McTire Smith, the 2nd Division commander had asked that the Corps Reserve, the 6th Combat Team, be released to his control. While he awaited a reply, Julian Smith had his staff working on a plan to organize the remaining division, support troops, engineers, clerks, engineers, and artillerymen, MSTDs, into provisional infantry battalions to be used in the fighting ashore. This drastic plan, which illustrated the desperate nature of the battle on D-Day, proved unnecessary. In less than an hour after he had asked for the reserves, Smith received his answer from Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. The 6th Marines were returned to 2nd Division Command. Now the General could take the risk of landing the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines. He sent a message to Colonel Shoup, asking him where he should land the battalion, on Beach Green, the western end of the island, or on Red 2 and 3, N2, and if a night landing of reinforcements was practical. The commander ashore never received the message. The communications failures continued to plague the operation. Later in the afternoon, as the men of Colonel Hall's group waited at the line of departure, cramped, wet, hungry, tired, and a large number seasick, the division ordered the colonel to make an attack, landing on the extreme eastern end of the island, and attack northwest toward Shoop's beachhead. Again, the word never reached the man for whom it was intended. The 8th Marines elements spent the remainder of the day and all night in the open boats, waiting for orders that never came. The division commander, anxious to see how the new plan of attack would work, sent his logistics officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jesse Shelton Cook, aloft as an observer in a Maryland scout plane. Cook was to report the movement of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines from the line of departure, and when he radioed back that a number of boats were moving toward Red 2, there was consternation in the division command post. Hall was landing on the wrong beach, but he was not. What Cook had seen was the landing craft vehicle's personnel, carrying the artillery batteries of the 1st Battalion, 10th Marines toward Betio. It was midnight before the truth finally filtered through the tangled communication channels, and the combat team headquarters and its single battalion were correctly located on division operations maps, still at the line of departure and not ashore on Red 2. The assistant division commander, General Hermley, was also a victim of the on-again, off-again radio traffic. Since General Smith, like Colonel Shoop, was anxious to clarify the situation ashore, he ordered Hermler to proceed to the end of the long pier, size up the situation, and report his findings back to the Maryland. After leaving the Monrovia with his staff, Hermley tried to contact Shoop and pinpoint the location of his command post, but he could not raise the 2nd Combat Team commander. When the assistant division commander did reach the pier at 40 minutes past 17, he reported that the area was under enemy fire. Then, when he tried to raise the Maryland again to report what news he had of the action ashore, his radios got no response. He sent a messenger with this information out to the nearest ship, so it could be relayed to the flagship. Meanwhile, he busied himself with squaring away the confusion at the pier's end and helped start carrying parties and reinforcements toward shore. It was early on the morning of D+1 before Hermley broke away from the pier and moved with his staff to the pursuit in order to use its radio and inform General Smith that Colonel Shoop wanted the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines to land on Red 2. After this message was sent at 45 minutes past 4, the assistant division commander was abruptly ordered to report to the division commander. When he reached the Maryland, Hermley found the usually benign Smith quite perturbed. It seems that he had ordered Hermley to take command of all troops ashore at 50 minutes past 17 the previous evening, and to report when he had an advanced division command post set up. Then, throughout the night, there had been no word of the fate of the assistant division commander's group. Once it became apparent that Hermley had not disobeyed his orders and was not a casualty, the atmosphere cleared. The upshot of this particular communication failure, however, was that Shoop remained in command on Betio on November 21st. Although the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines could have been used ashore on D-Day, it is doubtful if it would have made it to the beach as a coherent unit. Very few battalions did. Only Major Crow was lucky enough to get most of his men on Betio in organized and familiar formations that were not torn apart by landing casualties. As a consequence, the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, was a bulwark of Shoop's beachhead, and the colonel relied heavily on Crow and his men. Perhaps the biggest boon to the men of the 8th Marines was the safe arrival of several Sherman medium tanks on their beach during the early hours of the D-Day action. Scheduled to land on Red 3 shortly after H-hour were the 2nd and 3rd platoons of Company C, 1st Marine Amphibious Corps Tank Battalion, a unit that had been foresightedly attached to the Tarawa attack forces. The 2nd Division's own tank companies were equipped with light tanks whose main armament was a 37mm gun, an excellent weapon against personnel but virtually useless in an attack on the enemy's concrete and steel bunkers. The Sherman's 75mm guns packed a close-range wallop that could knock out the smaller Japanese emplacements. Although no guides were available off Red 3 to lead the mediums across the reef, 7 tanks threaded their way through the shell holes and wrecked amphibious tractors safely. Only one was lost when it plunged into an unseen depression. Finding a break in the seawall, the 4 tanks of the 3rd platoon reported to Major Crow about 11:30. About the same time, 3 tanks of the 2nd platoon turned west toward Red 2 to find Colonel Shoop. Crowe immediately put his Shermans to use, adding their punch to the drive to the south and east by the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, and the bits and pieces of the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines that had reached shore. In its first hour of battle, one Sherman was knocked out by a dive bomber as it was working forward of the lines in the area being hit by air and naval gunfire support. In short order, 2 more tanks were aflame and abandoned, one when it blundered into a pit crowded with fuel drums, which were promptly set afire by the bombers, and the other when it was wrecked by Japanese gunfire. The remaining tank, although hit repeatedly by enemy gunners, remained in action, moving to the left flank of Crowe's position, where strong resistance was centered on a steel pillbox and a large concrete bunker near the end of the Burnsfield pier. This pier, named after the British company that had exported copra from the Gilberts in pre-war years, extended 200 feet out onto the reef. It marked the eastern limit of Crowe's holdings on D-Day, a point about 400 yards from the long pier at the Red 2 Red 3 boundary. Company F of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, which initially worked against the defences near the Burnsfield pier, had suffered heavy casualties from Japanese grenades when it was pinned down by machine gun fire. Crowe ordered Company G over to reinforce F and moved what was left of Company K of the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, into position to the right, where it joined its lines to those of Company E. Company E had moved into the triangle formed by the east and west taxi strips of the island's airfield. About 35 men from Companies I and L of the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, all that had gotten ashore by mid-afternoon, were used to outpost the right flank of the position in the triangle. Later, when Major Rood got ashore, this group was doubled in strength, with naval guns pounding the eastern end of the island and carrier planes hitting the Japanese defences on the ocean shore. There was a ring of flame and explosions around Major Crowe's perimeter. The impact area, however, was several hundred yards from the small groups of Marines taking cover in shell holes and the confusing tangle of debris that littered the island. Close in, the Japanese were free to meet the Americans head-on, and the enemy positions could only be taken by close-quarter fighting. In an attempt to advance east down the lagoon shore, the engineer flamethrower and demolition teams attached to the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, led by 1st Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman, Jr., worked on the south entrance to the big bunker forward of Company F's lines. At the same time, an infantry platoon tried to move past its south flank. Machine gun fire from the steel pillbox to the left, and from other positions to the front, practically wiped out the platoon. This loss prompted a decision by Crowe to hold what he had in this area and stand fast. Further inland, Company K of the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, menaced by a Japanese tank that could be seen manoeuvring near the end of the eastern taxiway, managed to manhandle 2 37mm guns up to its lines. The fire of these guns drove off the tank, which disappeared into the tangle of undergrowth, twisted and battered trees, and half-seen structures that characterized the eastern end of Betio. The 37s also scattered a group of 100 to 200 Japanese, who were spotted moving through the brush from the south to the north shore during the afternoon. After these incidents, the guns were incorporated into the frontline defences, and most efforts were bent toward building up strength on the perimeter for the fast-approaching night. The 8th Marines reinforcements for Red 3, Major Rood's 3rd Battalion, continued to come in during the afternoon. Rood made radio contact with Crowe about 1400 hours, and the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines commander, briefed him on the situation ashore. After Rood went to the pursuit to fill Colonel Hall in on the picture of what was happening to his men on Betio, the Major returned to his troops, and at 1500 hours was ordered by Colonel Shoup to land the rest of his battalion, coming in along the west side of the long pier. During the next several hours, the Marines came ashore by any means possible, in landing vehicles tracked when they could find space in them, but mostly on foot. With Shoup's permission, Lieutenant Colonel Carlson delayed his trip out to the Maryland and diverted his amphibious tractor to the pier to load and land several groups of Marines from the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, who had taken shelter from the unceasing enemy fire under and alongside the structure. Major Rood led some of his men to shore and left his executive officer at the pier's end to organize and send in anyone else he could find from the boat teams that had been scattered and driven to cover as soon as they set foot on the reef. On Betio, Major Rood reported to Colonel Shoup and was ordered to reorganize Companies I and L of his battalion, taking up defensive positions in the airfield triangle directly inland from the long pier. Rood's Company K was by now so integrated into the defences of the 2nd Battalion 8th Marines, that it remained under Crow's command for the rest of the struggle to capture the island. In the center of Shoop's beachhead, the landing of Major Kyle's battalion gave the colonel a chance to extend his lines inland and get some breathing space near the beach. Companies A and B of the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, had been hard hit during their landing, but the survivors pushed inland wherever their tractors put them ashore, with most of them bunched in an area within 150 to 200 yards of the pier. About 25 men from Company A, led by their company commander, advanced to the edge of the western taxi strip before enemy fire drove them back. Like the Marines of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, those of the 1st Battalion then started the dangerous and seemingly unending process of destroying Japanese defensive positions one by one, in a process that one senior army general was later to describe aptly as the blowtorch and corkscrew method. Engineer teams with flamethrowers, satchel charges, and Bangalore torpedoes attempted to annihilate the Japanese by searing the firing ports of emplacements with flame, while demolitions were placed to seal all openings. Infantry covering fire was an essential part of this teamwork. The cost of such attacks was high. There was virtually no way to approach the mutually supporting defensive positions without being nakedly exposed to enemy fire. Once a breach was made, however, the way was open for a tiny advance, but the pace was painfully slow, and the destruction drama had to be played over and over again without any end to the casualties. Until the band of coastal defences was eliminated, no one could walk upright with impunity on Betio. The usual stance on D-Day was a low crouch in the lee of the 4-foot-high seawall and a crawl anywhere inland. The attack troops knew that the Japanese were looking right down their throats, and yet there was always someone ready to lead an attack and others to follow. Courage on Betio was so commonplace that many fantastic acts of heroism and self-sacrifice went unnoticed in the general sharing of danger. 3 of the Shermans that had landed on Red 3 reported to Colonel Shoop about noon, and he sent them west to attempt to break through to the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, on Red 1. As they approached the enemy strongpoint complex on the beach boundary, the Marines, strung out along the right flank in any position that offered them cover, waved the mediums back. The defending fire was too strong even for the Shermans. When the tank platoon shifted to the left to help Marines cross the west taxi strip, it suffered much the same fate as the platoon on Red 3. One medium plunged into a deep shell hole and had to be abandoned. Another was disabled by a mine. The survivor kept fighting, attacking close-in emplacements at point-blank range and shelling the ones further out from which enemy fire was raking the Marines. The attack across the taxi strip was part of a general advance ordered by Colonel Shoop at 1400 hours. Major Kyle had landed and taken command of his battalion about 13:30, and he and Lieutenant Colonel Jordan were directed to drive toward the south shore of the island. Jordan's battalion, with many of its infantry and heavy weapons squads either knocked out or driven ashore on Red 1, was grossly under strength. He could do little more than consolidate his hold on the right flank of the beachhead. Kyle was able to advance Company B into the taxi strip triangle. Company A joined it there and tied in on the right, and Company C extended the line back toward the beach. These gains were made only after hours of furious small unit battles that left the survivors exhausted, but still strong enough and wise enough to dig in as dusk approached. On the extreme right flank, what was left of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines held a tenuous line with 57 men from 4 companies occupying the forward positions. Despite the severe casualties that the 4 battalions in Shoop's beachhead had suffered in getting ashore and establishing a toehold on the island, there was no sense of panic in the lines as the Marines set up for night defense. Stragglers kept appearing from the beach. Here, an 81mm mortar squad, lugging its heavy loads of tube, baseplate, and ammunition. There, a machine gun and its crew or a small group of riflemen. These Marines were fed into the lines wherever a gap occurred, and there were many, or they were pulled together into makeshift reserve forces without much regard to what unit they might have belonged to. There might be time to sort everyone out the next day, but at dusk on November 20th, the business at hand was to see that there were Marines on Betio the next day. The Battle of Red 1, like that on the central beachhead, was also influenced by the landing of medium tanks on the morning of D-Day. After Major Chotel turned the landing craft mechanized back to the reef, the boats unloaded the 30-ton Shermans on the edge of the coral shelf. Guides carrying flags to mark holes in the reef preceded the 6 tanks, wading through more than 1,000 yards of water and taking casualties as enemy machine gunners found the unprotected men easy targets. When the mediums approached the beach, they found the narrow strip of sand crowded with dead and wounded Marines. The tank group commander, unwilling to take the risk of threading his way through the casualties, led his Shermans west around the beak of Betio to a position off Green Beach. It was during this detour that 4 of the tanks lunged into holes and drowned out. The 2 remaining then moved inland through a breach in the seawall blasted by engineers. Major Ryan welcomed the Shermans' firepower and crushing action and put them to work shooting up the Green Beach defences. The Major had decided that he did not have enough men to sweep the length of Red 1 and was going to concentrate on securing Green Beach. As the senior officer of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines ashore, he had taken command of the battalion when he and the other company commanders decided that it was highly improbable that anyone from the headquarters units would be able to get through the Japanese fire off Red 1. About 1400 hours, Ryan organized an attack to the south and put his 2 tanks out in front to lead the way. The battalion 81mm mortars furnished suppressive fire, and the men, surprisingly, were able to advance, taking successive Japanese positions from the flank. The enemy fire was heavy and accurate. 1 tank was knocked out of action and set afire. The remaining Sherman had its turret and 75mm gun immobilized by a crippling hit, but the bow machine gun was still active and was used to provide covering fire for the infantry. The attack was continually frustrated by the shortage of flamethrower fuel and demolitions, for the loads the engineers had carried ashore were quickly used up. Despite this handicap, the Marines overran many enemy positions, reaching an anti-tank ditch 300 yards from the southern shore, but they could not destroy the emplacements they had bypassed. Carrying parties and stretcher-bearers were fired on continually as they made their way to and from Red 1. The volume of enemy defending fire grew more intense with every foot the Marines moved forward. Convinced that his men were overextended and that the Japanese would counterattack, Major Ryan pulled in his attack units and fell back to a beachhead perimeter about 300 yards deep and 150 yards wide. At 1800 hours, in response to a radio message from Colonel Shoup, he reported his night defensive position, but did not mention the day's advance. Like many such messages, this one did not reach Shoup, and the combat team commander was still unsure of the situation on Red 1. The radio Ryan used was one brought ashore by Major Rice, the executive officer of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, who had been driven ashore on Red 1 like so many others destined for Red 2. Some, but not all of these men were absorbed by Ryan into his defensive perimeter. He had been so busy directing the attack inland that he had only a general idea of the number of men and variety of units that had landed on Red 1. Actually, he had the remnants of 3 rifle companies and 1 machine gun platoon from his own battalion, 2 rifle platoons and 2 machine gun platoons from the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, and about 100 men from the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines. In addition to these men, there were a number of dismounted tank and amphibious tractor crewmen, some heavy weapons crews that had lost their pieces coming ashore, some spare engineers and communicators, and a variety of other specialists, most of whom were christened infantrymen and used as combat replacements as the critical need for men arose. Everyone in the northwest corner of Betio, whether he was on Ryan's front line or on the beach, dug in as darkness fell in order to meet the universally expected counterattack. In order to supplement the meager supplies of ammunition, rations and water he had after a day's fighting, Major Ryan sent men out on the reef to strip the wrecked tractors of anything useful. A few undamaged landing vehicles tracked with vitally needed replenishment supplies did reach Red 1 after dark, but for the most part, Ryan's collection of assorted units had to make do with what they had. The steadily dwindling supply of tractors had been concentrated in resupply operations to Red 2. The boat channel alongside the pier, which offered some protection to the precious tractors, was the prime route of approach to both Red 2 and 3 for both men and supplies after the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines and 1st Battalion. 2nd Marines had put their first waves ashore. The expenditure rate of all types of ammunition was very high in a battle as savagely fought as that for Betio, and the need for constant resupply was critical. Medical supplies, particularly blood plasma, were often scarce as seriously wounded men were carried back to beach aid stations in such numbers that the doctors and corpsmen were hard put to keep up with the flow. There were many other resupply items that had to reach Betio: batteries for dead radios, water to replenish the 2 canteens that each man had carried ashore, enormous quantities of demolitions, fuel for flamethrowers. The list was endless, and all of it had to funnel down the side of the pier. When General Hermler reached the end of the pier in the waning hours of the afternoon, the scene was chaotic. Boats were milling around off the reef, waiting for a chance to dash in and unload on the pier head or marry up with a landing vehicle tracked, trading supplies for casualties. Scores of men were huddled under the pier or hugging its sides. A few staunch souls were ignoring the intermittent enemy fire and trying to speed the unloading process or rounding up small groups of Marines to make a try for the beach. The general immediately took charge of the resupply and reinforcement efforts. He used his own staff and Major Stanley Earl Larson, executive officer of the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, to organize carrying parties of infantrymen to help clear the jam of ammunition boxes, water cans, and shells. Intermittent contact with Colonel Shoup let him know what was needed most ashore, and these were the items that were loaded in the landing vehicles tracked and given to the human pack horses. Earlier in the day, eager coxswains from the transports and cargo vessels, spurred on by Captain Knowles' pre-landing instructions to keep the boats moving and get the stuff to the Marines, had brought in whatever was loaded in their landing craft vehicles' personnel. And the tractor crews, using any help they could find at the reef's edge, had brought in this gear, just as convinced it was needed ashore. At sea, the ship commanders, anxious to clear their holds in these dangerous waters, had unloaded a miscellany of equipment, weapons, and supplies that had little relation to the material that Colonel Shoup found he needed. More than a little annoyed by this experience, the colonel was to become a strong advocate of letting the commander ashore determine what should be landed. General Hermler, in order to get a first-hand account of what was happening on Betio and to find where Colonel Shoup wanted reinforcements landed, sent Major Rathvon McClure Tompkins and Captain Thomas Alfred Dutton into Red 2 about 19:30. Like the Marines struggling with their loads and weapons, the two officers had a difficult time finding their way to the beach. Japanese machine gun and anti-boat gunfire had not slackened much with darkness, and a new threat had been added, since bullets were hitting among the files of men that obviously came from positions offshore. Some enemy snipers had moved out on the reef to occupy the low-lying ship hulk that stood off the right end of Red 2, and others had found firing positions in the wrecked amphibious tractors that were scattered all over the reef. Despite the wealth of defending fire and the variety of angles from which it came, the curtain of darkness saved the lives of many Marines who came ashore on the night of November 20th, 21st. Some men were even emboldened to speed their trip to shore by climbing up on the pier, but the white coral grit surface silhouetted their figures, and the attention they drew from alert Japanese gunners discouraged this experiment. There was no fast way to reach Betio when you were afoot. You had to drag yourself through the water. When many of the Marines from the carrying parties reached shore, they dumped their loads and, if no one stopped them, they had a tendency to stay where they were, slumping exhausted against any open spot they could find on the seawall. Remembering this scene with a professional soldier's eye, Major Tompkins was struck by the inviting target it presented. He wondered why the Japanese did not use mortars on the first night. People were lying on the beach so thick you could not walk. All they had to do was fire at the water's edge, and they would have annihilated hundreds of Marines. But the Japanese did not fire their mortars, and they did not launch a counterattack, a fact that puzzled nearly every Marine ashore. The American situation was precarious, and the Japanese still had a sizable garrison on Betio with which to launch an attack. Reflection on this welcome omission led most Marine leaders in the battle to conclude that enemy wire communications had been destroyed in the preliminary bombardment. There appeared to be no radios at small unit levels, and the Japanese naval troops evidently made little use of messengers. No field message blanks were found on Betio, although they had been captured frequently in previous operations. It appeared that Admiral Keiji Shibasaki was not able to mount a coordinated counterattack, but then that may not have been what he intended. Holed up in their formidable defences, the Japanese were more dangerous than they might have been charging into Marine gunfire. The gradual build-up of supplies was matched by an increase in Marine firepower too. Lieutenant Colonel Rixey and Colonel Shoup had decided to land Rixey's pack howitzers on Red 2 instead of Red 1, where the original landing plans had called for them to go ashore. A gun section each from batteries A and B of the 1st Battalion. 10th Marines were transferred to landing vehicles tracked and reached the beach without mishap. 3 other sections from Battery C, which received the word to land before their guns were transferred to tractors, had to manhandle their weapons across the reef. None of the packs reached Betio until after dark, and all stayed near the beach to await first light so they could register. Once they had been briefed by Colonel Shoup, Major Tompkins and Captain Dutton began the tortuous journey out to the pier's end to report to General Hermley. Toward midnight, the moon rose, and its light made the trip through the exposed areas near the pier even more unpleasant than the trip shoreward had been. It was 45 minutes past 3 before the two officers found the assistant division commander and gave him their news, and it was shortly after this that Hermley went out to the pursuit to contact division headquarters, leaving the logistics officer of his staff, Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Barclay Atkinson, to control the movement of supplies toward shore. The Japanese made one futile gesture during the night. About 8 enemy planes came over the island and dropped 3 sticks of bombs. The Marines, waiting quietly in their foxholes for the enemy infantry to appear, were treated to the sight of vivid explosions from the bombing erupting in territory held by the Japanese. It was this quiet waiting that struck experienced observers most vividly about the first night on Betio. Despite the fact that many of the small groups of Marines that manned the far-from-solid perimeters were strangers to each other and to their leaders, there was remarkable fire discipline. It was as if the men of the division had forged a tremendous unspoken confidence in themselves during the day's trials on the reefs and beaches of Betio. Once the division staff on the Maryland was aware of the location of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, following a report by Colonel Hall that his men were resting easy in their boats near the pursuit, the scheme of landing on the eastern end of Betio was revived. The 8th Marines commander was directed to arrange with Navy control officers for a new line of departure off the eastern beaches and to make other preparations for a landing at 9 in the morning. Soon thereafter, General Hermley's report that Colonel Shoup wanted the reserve battalion landed on Red 2 cancelled the plans for the attack on the island's tail. Instead, Hall received orders to land the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines immediately on Red 2. Once the troops were ashore, they were to attack west toward Ryan's beachhead. The tide had gone out during the night, and large areas of the reef near the shore were exposed. The receding waters also revealed the bloated bodies of Marines dead during the previous day's landings, their cadavers now added to the macabre scene of desolation on the reef. The sun was not yet high, but the dawn air was hot and humid and carried a sickening stench, the natural consequence of unburied dead in the tropics. The unforgettable odor was everywhere. The men on Betio were saturated with it. It clung to their clothing and filled their nostrils. And it reached out across the reef and provided an unpleasant foretaste of the island to the men of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines. The first wave of landing craft vehicles personnel grounded on the reef at 15 minutes past 6, and the infantrymen and attack engineers jumped off the ramps and spread out to begin a 500-yard walk to the shore. Along the beach, the Americans who had made it in on D-Day turned to watch the grisly drama of others braving the defenders' fire. Japanese machine guns, never silent during the night, now increased their fire, and the snipers holed up in the ship. Hulk opened up on the backs of the men trudging shoreward. Here and there a Marine dropped, and another rushed to help him, often too late. A shell would explode, and when the geyser of water fell back, whole groups of lifeless figures bobbed in the area. 4 waves of men kept coming in despite the heavy casualties, which seemed to the men on shore to be worse than those on D-Day. The enemy still held positions that covered the reef, and hidden guns lashed out at the helpless targets without let-up. The Marine pack howitzers were able to stop some of this Japanese fire that was hitting the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines. During the night, a bulldozer that had miraculously reached the island had thrown up an earth embankment to protect the 5-gun composite battery of the 1st Battalion, 10th Marines. Early in the morning, Rixey and his men moved 2 of the guns from the cover of this position to the right flank of Red 2, about 125 yards from 2 blockhouses on the beach boundary, whose machine guns were hammering at the men on the reef. Disabled landing vehicles. Tracked partially masked the line of sight to the enemy gun ports, and Rixey personally sighted the howitzers to take as much advantage as possible from the cover offered by the wrecked vehicles. At 7 minutes past 7, using high-explosive ammunition with delay fuses and minimum elevation, the gunners opened fire. The shells penetrated the embrasures and silenced the enemy guns temporarily, long enough to give the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines a better chance to reach shore. Once this welcome task was finished, the howitzers were moved back to their main firing position, and by 8 o'clock, all guns were ready to support the day's operations. About this same time, Major Lawrence Charles Hayes, Jr., commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, reported to Colonel Shoup for orders. About half of his battalion was now ashore, but it was badly disorganized by the punishment it had suffered. All flamethrowers, demolitions packs, and heavy weapons had been lost during the landing. Many of the men of the first waves had taken cover behind various wrecks and anti-boat obstacles offshore, and these Marines continued to come in all morning, dashing for the beach whenever there appeared to be a let-up in the fury of Japanese fire. The heavy weapons equipment of the battalion and of the regimental and headquarters and service companies had not landed. Navy boat control officers stopped the fifth wave from going into the reef, so that carrier planes could attack the Japanese in the wrecked ship offshore. The results of this aerial attack, which featured Hellcats strafing and bombing the wreck, were inconclusive. The fighter pilots could hit the ship with their wing guns, but as bombardiers, they left much to be desired. Most bombs exploded well away from the target, a condition that sometimes occurred ashore. As the tide again shifted, the landing craft carrying the 37mm guns, 75mm half-tracks, jeeps, radios, and other heavy gear of the 8th Marines again headed in for the island. For the most part this time, the men and material came ashore along the pier, filtering in during the rest of the morning and the early afternoon. By 1400 hours, Colonel Hall had most of his headquarters and supporting elements ashore. There had been some losses, but nothing to approach the havoc wrought among the rifle companies of Hayes's battalion. Although Hall was senior to Shoup, he did not assume command once he was ashore. He considered that nothing would be gained by doing so, that Shoup was the officer that General Smith had chosen to lead the attack, and that under the circumstances prevailing on Betio, the junior colonel was in a position to know more about what was going on ashore. Instead, Hall made his communications equipment available to Shoup, giving him a more reliable means of reaching the division command post, and used the 8th Marines headquarters and service troops to assist in supply and evacuation operations. He dispatched his weapons sections to reinforce the front lines wherever they were needed. In view of the complicated minute-to-minute changes of the situation on Betio, Hall's decision was a wise one, as Shoup and his omnipresent operations officer, Major Thomas Anthony Culhane Jr., were probably the only individuals on the island who had an overall grasp of what was happening. Shoup's leadership, of necessity, was personal, and he was deeply involved in every facet of the operation. And his exposure to danger was hardly less than that of many Marines on Betio, for snipers continually took his command post under fire, and the bunker against which he had set his headquarters was still occupied by Japanese troops. Guards had to be set at the bunker's entrances to check a sally by the occupants, who were eventually eliminated by a combination of demolitions and bulldozer. While he could not make contact with Major Ryan, the reports Shoup received regarding progress on the western beachhead were encouraging. He was determined to link up the two groups of Marines. His orders to Major Hayes were to take over the right flank of the beachhead, reorganize his battalion, and attack to establish contact with the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. As the units of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines were fed into the positions facing the enemy strongpoints on the beach boundary, they relieved an odd assortment of Marines in many ways typical of the composite units that held the perimeters on the night of D-Day. Besides the handful of survivors of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, there were men from the 2nd Marines Headquarters and Service Company, Lieutenant Hawkins' Scout Sniper Platoon, Major Schertl's Headquarters elements, and a group of amphibious tractor crewmen whose landing vehicles tracked lay wrecked on the reef and beach. When the relief was effected, Lieutenant Hawkins was not with his men. He had joined Sergeant Bordelon in the ranks of posthumous Medal of Honor winners. Wounded by a Japanese mortar shell on D-Day, the scout leader had ignored the injury and helped to set night defenses on the right flank of Red 2. At dawn, he led an attack on a Japanese emplacement bristling with 5 machine guns, crawling forward to fire point-blank into the gun ports and using grenades to finish off the occupants. Wounded again in this attack, this time in the chest, he kept on fighting, destroying 3 more pillboxes before an enemy shell burst practically tore him apart. Even then, his indomitable spirit kept him alive for hours to the amazement of all who saw his multiple wounds. Even with the efforts of men like Hawkins and his platoon, the Japanese positions on the western edge of Red 2 seemed as strong as ever when Major Hayes was ready to launch his attack at noon. He had 1 medium tank to furnish support, but its 75mm gun and machine guns did not provide nearly enough firepower to make a dent in the enemy defenses. When the Marines of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, rose from the foxholes they had taken over, They were immediately driven to the ground by a surge of machine gun fire.